Last week, we began our discussion of queer theory, a critical analysis of the social construction of sexuality that challenges the binary of sexuality as well as the notion of essentialism. Queer theory also finds categories of gender and sexuality limiting, and rather views gender and sexuality as something fluid or in flux. Today, we'll take that understanding of queer theory and apply it to two questions related to marriage. The first question is marriage equality queer? And the second question is, can heterosexual marriages be queer? Throughout this semester, we've talked multiple times about heteronormativity, or the notion that heterosexuality is normal, natural, and desirable. In contrast, today we'll be talking about homonormativity. Homonormativity is the mimicking of heterosexual ideals and constructs within LGBT culture and identities. Homonormativity is the privileging of heteronormative values and beliefs within queer spaces. It's predicated on the assumption that the norms and values of heterosexuality should be replicated and performed among non-heterosexual people. For example, queer folks who get married, adopt children, attend church every weekend, and live in a suburban neighborhood with a nice white picket fence would be an example of homonormativity. Now, none of these things are inherently negative, but they can be problematic when the desires of both the lifestyle and the traits that we have determined who we can interact with, who we help, and who we support, especially within a marginalized community. You might be surprised to hear that within some LGBTQIA spaces, marriage is a deeply divisive issue. No one would argue that there's anything wrong with the desire to have your relationship recognized by the state, to adopt children, or to have your partner be able to access benefits such as medical aid or insurance. The issue that emerged even before marriage equality passed in 2015 was a question: would marriage become the best or only way of existing as a gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, intersex, asexual, or queer person in the world? The argument was, if this happened, if marriage became the expected norm for all queer people, exclusion would follow. Those who didn't fit the norm would be shut out of social spaces, and their issues wouldn't receive the same amount of attention when it came to advocacy or lobbying. Their rights and needs would be ignored or deemed not significant enough. This could be extremely dangerous, too. Homonormativity, like heteronormativity, privileges certain lives over others and makes it possible for society to overlook hate crimes against queer and transgender people. Folks were concerned that we might see more of this overlooking of hate crimes, especially amongst those who didn't fit in to the homonormative notion of marriage. For many heterosexual individuals, marriage is the expected norm. And sex within heterosexual marriage has always been the most socially acceptable sexual interaction, especially if it was for reproduction. However, today, sex is no longer tied to reproduction, love, or even intimacy, even within the context of marriage. Sex is now, for many people, valued as a source of pleasure and or as a form of self-expression. Consider that in 2011, 50 Shades of Grey was released, and it brought BDSM into the mainstream. Many married heterosexual couples began openly admitting that they were practicing elements of BDSM within their married sex life, And this refers obviously to practices of domination, bondage, or sadomasochism. This challenged many of our earlier cultural notions about sex and marriage, and for many people changed the ways that they viewed sex within a married relationship. Some have even argued that the acceptance of BDSM within, quote, the sanctity of marriage, or our current cultural climate, would never have been possible without the work of gay activists and politics of the previous decades. So now reflect on the two cases that we looked at in this mini lecture and think about it from the context or framing of queer theory, a critical analysis that explores the social construction of sexuality, that challenges ideas of sexual binaries and essentialisms, that opposes gender and sexuality classifications and embraces the concepts of gender and sexuality as fluid or influx. Now go back to the two questions. How queer is marriage equality? And can heterosexual marriage be queer?